Today is December 12th, and it's 11 o'clock a.m. Eastern Time. So we're going to continue our study of Aristotle's Rhetoric. In our last class, maybe two classes, we looked at the first chapter of the first book of Aristotle's Rhetoric. And in that first chapter, we looked at some important introductory issues. We talked about the relationship between rhetoric and dialectic. We talked about the importance of rhetoric, and I'll review some of that in just a minute. But just got us started and moving in the study of the art of rhetoric. What's really important for us to understand when we get into these studies, and this is really the purpose of the Classical Liberal Arts and the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, is that there are some studies that are specialized studies that you really only need if you intend to work in a certain field, like high-level modern mathematics, like calculus, for example. If you're going to work in engineering, you might need calculus, but for most people, you're never going to run into any problems that require calculus. Those are specialized sciences. We can think of medicine and law and many other professional sciences. They're specialized, and the people who study them and master them are called specialists. And that's how our society works, because there are so many people, and because the common good is pursued when we specialize and offer our specialties to help one another so that we can all enjoy a higher quality of life. It's nice for me not to have to fix my own car, but know that I can just bring it to a mechanic and stay focused on my own life's work. That's what makes quality of life what it can be for human beings, and it's why it's important for us to live in society and not isolate ourselves. God intended us to have a certain culture, a certain quality of life, and that quality of life is only possible when human beings collaborate and offer all of their different interests and talents and abilities for the benefit of one another. And we're not left all trying to, grow potatoes every day and clothe ourselves. We're allowed to pursue higher, more intellectual, better spiritual things, more cultured things because of that collaboration. Even the use of our intellect, like to invent machines and equipment and technology that does basic tasks for us so that we can continually focus our attention on more intellectual or spiritual tasks, and again, improve the quality of life that we all enjoy. But when it comes to the classical liberal arts, they're different. They're not like the arts or sciences of specialists. The classical liberal arts, especially the first three, grammar, logic, or grammar, reasoning, and rhetoric, they're general sciences, general arts and sciences that are of interest to all human beings. And so I would argue they're the most important arts and sciences, not because the others are not important, but because they're necessary for everyone. It would be good for everyone to become masters of the classical liberal arts. And again, most importantly, the first three, grammar, reasoning, and rhetoric. The other four of the seven classical liberal arts, the mathematical arts, they're really intended for philosophical studies. So anyone who wants to pursue philosophical studies, which are still necessary for many learned professions like law and medicine and politics and education and religion and so on. Those who want to get into philosophy would do well to go through classical mathematics, but everyone has an interest in grammar, reasoning, and rhetoric, the arts of the trivium, the first three of the seven classical liberal arts. And you've got to be careful today, because liberal arts is used in modern language to mean something else. It's used to mean studies that really don't have a professional purpose, like history studies or literature studies. All of that stuff is just lumped under liberal arts, even though they're not arts at all. It's just what modern society often does is keep names from the past and just drag them into new contexts and continue using the names. So there's this feeling of continuity, even though there's no continuity. So that's one of the problems in modern circles. When we talk about liberal arts, people think about really nonsense studies in colleges like art appreciation and things like that. But when we talk about the classical liberal arts, we're talking about arts that are real arts, that are skills gained through learning and practice. And they're essential for all people. They're most practical and necessary for every area of life. Even if someone said, I don't want a career, I just want to be a housewife. Grammar, reasoning, and rhetoric are essential for the work of a mother and a housewife. So no matter what kind of work we get into, even if we don't think it's intellectual, even if we don't think of it as a profession, these are basic human skills that we need to study and learn. And that's why in the ancient world, they were the focus of education. So in this course, we're getting into the art of rhetoric, which is the third of those first three classical liberal arts. And what Aristotle emphasizes in the first chapter is that you can't really separate these arts. They're not like three separate arts. They're all kind of entangled with each other, but they are three separate arts. And so we've got grammar, which we study through our grammar courses. We learn the words, we learn the alphabets, the sounds, how ideas are expressed in different languages. That's what grammar is about, learning how to rightly name and express ideas. That's the art of grammar. And even there, you can see how important that is, because if we're careless or sloppy with language and words, we introduce all kinds of confusion. I just gave an example how the phrase liberal arts is used today differently than it was used in the past. That introduces confusion when we talk about liberal arts. So grammar is an important part of reasoning. Grammar is an important part of rhetoric. They're all entangled with each other. And then when we go into reasoning, we learn about how arguments are formed, how judgments are formed, how we actually order the ideas, the propositions and judgments of our souls, how we rightly order them, and how we can learn to invent or discover logical arguments. And that's going to be an important part of rhetoric as well. And then when we come to rhetoric, the focus changes a little bit because it becomes political, whereas reasoning is more personal and private. We reason within ourselves. We reason privately. We solve problems and come up with arguments privately. That's where the solitude of the philosopher is found. But rhetoric is where we begin to turn outward and try to influence society around us. It's political because, as we learn in ethics, we begin to seek not only our own good, not only our own happiness, but we begin to seek the happiness of our neighbors as well. And the rhetorical art has as its end the common good. So it's really a political art or a political science because it's not private. So that's how these three arts of the trivium, these first three classical liberal arts, relate to everyone's life, no matter what field we're going to get into. It's also important to realize that our professional fields, the professions we take up, the occupations or vocations we pursue, that's only part of our life. For example, I'm obviously a teacher and a school administrator, but that's just part of my life. I also have a family life. I also have a religious life. I also have a political life. There's a lot more to my life than just my professional work. There's other aspects of our lives that we often neglect and don't prepare for. So as students growing up, you've got to think of more than just going to college or getting a degree and getting a job or choosing a vocation. You've got to think about life in general, because the end of the human life, as we learn in ethics, is happiness. And just because you have a certain degree or a certain job doesn't mean you're going to be happy. So there's a lot more to life than just, zeroing in on our profession and pretending that as long as we accomplish our professional goals, everything else is going to take care of itself. That's not true. We see many people who are very successful in professional pursuits whose lives outside of their professions are a train wreck, and it ends up taking down their professional life as well. So we've got to think of ourselves as human beings first, who are seeking the end of the human life. And our professions or our college plans and things like that, that's just a part of our life. We've got to have a plan for our whole life. That includes relationships, family, religion, our own health and fitness, happiness in general. So when we think about preparing ourselves for adult life and all of the challenges that we're going to have to deal with, these arts, grammar, reasoning, rhetoric, the philosophical sciences, theology, they really become crucial for human happiness. There's much more for us to think about than the check boxes that need to be completed for us to get a certain diploma or degree or a job interview and so on. We've got to be happy. That's a much more complicated pursuit than a career. So as we get into rhetoric, again, to review chapter 1, Aristotle said that rhetoric and dialectic are sort of related to each other. And it's important for us to understand that logic and dialectic, these words we use, reasoning, logic, dialectic, they don't all mean the same thing. Remember that Aristotle invented or discovered the art of demonstrative reasoning. It didn't exist before him. So when Plato refers to logic, or when Plato refers to dialectic, he's not talking about the same thing that Aristotle's talking about when he talks about logic or analytics or reasoning. So we've got to understand that there's a historical development of philosophy that's causing things to change over time. And we've always got to know the chronology and know where we're at in that chronology. So we're studying Aristotle. Things have developed since the time of Plato, when Aristotle's writing and teaching this art of rhetoric. And when he talks about dialectic, he's talking about one kind of reasoning, one kind of reasoning. Dialectic is the kind of reasoning that we see Socrates doing in Plato's dialogues. That was the kind of reasoning that Plato understood and used in his dialogues. That's the kind of reasoning Socrates used in his discussions. That's dialectic in Plato's world. That's logic in Plato's world. But in Aristotle's world, dialectic is just one kind of reasoning, because there's another kind that Aristotle was the inventor of. Not that he created it, but he discovered it and was able to establish the art of demonstrative reasoning. Demonstrative reasoning is scientific reasoning. It's the kind of reasoning that proves the truth of philosophical sciences. It proves things to be true. That's what Plato and dialectic could not do. Aristotle establishes the philosophical sciences by means of demonstrative reasoning. Dialectical reasoning is good for proving false arguments to be false by leading people into contradictions and showing that certain opinions are impossible. So dialectical reasoning is helpful in showing what ideas can't be true, but it doesn't establish the truth. And so it can't establish any kind of positive philosophy or theology. So when Aristotle in chapter 1 says that rhetoric and dialectic go together, realize that he's talking about one kind of reasoning, the kind of reasoning we see Socrates doing in the dialogues. And if you've never read Plato's dialogues, when you get some time, either over a school break or over the summer or something like that, read some of Plato's dialogues. They're really good. You can get them on audiobook format, so you can just listen to them if you're traveling, or if you're out working in the garden, or going for a walk, or riding your bike, or sitting on the beach. You can just listen to these works. They're really worth listening to, and it's good for you to be familiar with them. But know that Aristotle takes us to a different level, and he establishes the philosophical sciences, ethics, physics, metaphysics, reasoning, and so on. All right, so understand what dialectic means. It's a certain kind of reasoning. It's a kind of reasoning where we don't begin our arguments with things that are certainly true. In demonstrative reasoning, we begin with absolute truths. We start, for example, with axioms, and we reason from those axioms. We start from things that we know to be true and begin our arguments there. That's why we can establish the truth of things with demonstrative reasoning. In dialectical reasoning, we do things differently. We start with a question. So I'll ask you a controversial question with a yes or no answer, and you'll pick the answer, and then we'll see where that leads us. And normally the answer that people pick is the answer that most people think is true, or wise people tend to think is true, but we're not sure. but we just explore and we see where these ideas lead us. So we'll let you say yes, and then we'll assume that the answer is yes, and we'll go on to the next question and think about how that yes answer affects the next question and the next question. And eventually, if you're wrong, if one of your answers is wrong, it'll lead us into a bind. We'll get stuck in a contradiction where something is impossible, something doesn't work, or it's reduced to absurdity. And we'll know that along the way, one of those answers cannot possibly be true, or all of those answers that you've given cannot possibly be true. And so what the dialectic does, it sort of works like a process of elimination to identify answers that can't possibly be true, so we can set them aside, but it never really establishes what the truth is. So the art of rhetoric, because it's political, because we're dealing with other people, we're dealing with other people's opinions, other people's beliefs, persuasions, desires, and so on, it has more to do with dialectic than with demonstrative reasoning. Demonstrative reasoning is really for the philosopher in his own private study, or for the teacher who's demonstrating something to a class of students. The work of rhetoric is more of a political art or a political science, and therefore it makes use more of dialectic. Its counterpart to dialectic. They go together. All right. So Aristotle talked about that in chapter 1. He also talked about how rhetoric, like dialectic, are of interest to all people, right? They're of interest to all people because just by human nature, we have to do things like accuse people, defend ourselves, argue different things, make difficult decisions, and so on. So these arts are of interest to everyone. And then lastly, he said that what's unique about them, and I already mentioned this, but he said that art, rhetoric, and dialectic they're not a specific science. They're not a specialty. They're a general art or a general science that apply to all different sciences. So they're of interest to everyone, whether you want to be a doctor or a lawyer or a missionary or a priest or a housewife or a farmer. These arts are going to be useful in your life, not necessarily for your everyday work, but remember, your life is more than just the work that you do. Your profession is just a part of your life. You're going to get into financial issues, legal issues, relationship issues, political issues. There's a lot more to business than just your profession. And so you're going to have some general wisdom or general understanding of these classical liberal arts to really do well. So having said all of that, the other thing he talks about in chapter 1 is that many people try to teach about rhetoric, or had tried to teach about rhetoric, but they miss the mark. They really don't focus on what's essential for rhetoric. They get distracted by other things. And the main thing that they try to do is figure out how to persuade people, how to make people agree with them, how to win arguments, how to win judgments or win votes and things like that. And Aristotle said that's not the purpose of rhetoric. The purpose of rhetoric is to present the truth as clearly as possible. That's the purpose of rhetoric. It's not a way to trick people. It's not a way to sell things to people. It's not a way to get away with crimes or defend guilty people. That's not rhetoric. That's immoral. No wise man would ever do that. The purpose of rhetoric is to present the truth as clearly and persuasively as it can possibly be presented. And then we have to be content with the results, because people have free will and they often make decisions that are not reasonable, or they make decisions that are contrary to the truth. And we talked about in the last class how Jesus performed miracles right in front of people and they walked away saying they didn't believe. So if miracles won't persuade people, then we can be pretty confident that our best arguments aren't necessarily going to persuade people either. It's our duty just to make sure that we've presented the truth as clearly and as persuasively, as helpfully, as reasonably as we possibly can, and then leave the results really to God's influence, because God's grace is necessary to lead people to act reasonably, to deny themselves and make decisions that are difficult, that may be costly for them, and so on. It's not an easy issue. It really requires God's grace working in people's lives to allow them to make the right decisions. And that's why even Jesus said, "No man can come to me unless my Father draws him." Jesus wasn't this he wasn't this desperate rhetorician begging people to believe, doing anything he could possibly think of to make people believe. There were certain things he knew were necessary. He desired to teach and prove the truth clearly. And after that, he knew that the results were, in his Father's hands, that there was no way that he could control those things. And that keeps us happy ourselves, because we don't feel that pressure to do things that we're really not asked to do. So we talked about all of that in chapter 1. Now in chapter 2, we're going to really dig in here and get to work. So that's a good overview and introduction of what we've done so far. And now I'd like to share the screen here and dig into chapter 2. So we're just going to read this, talk about it as we go. We're not going to get through chapter 2 in one meeting. It's a long lesson, and it's got a lot of important content. So we're just going to take our time, read through it, make sure we understand everything. And if it takes us 3 videos, even if it takes us 4 videos, I really don't care about that. I just want to make sure that everything's clear, so you guys understand things easily from the beginning, and you can get these assignments done without any errors or confusion. So let's read or start reading chapter 2 of book 1 of Aristotle's Rhetoric here, translated by Thomas Taylor. Aristotle writes, "Now, therefore, having introduced the art of rhetoric and gotten through that stuff, we shall endeavor to speak concerning the method itself, that is, the rhetorical art, and show how and from what particulars we may be able to obtain the end proposed by this art." So now let's dig into the art itself. Enough of that introduction stuff. Now let's get into the method itself, the rhetorical art, and show how we may be able to obtain the end, which is going to be discussed. You can see it in italics here in the next sentence or so. How we may be able to obtain the end that is proposed by this art. And remember, many people err by thinking that rhetoric is the art of persuasion. Rhetoric is not the art of persuasion, because we cannot persuade people because of free will. We cannot persuade people. If you present a true argument, people are not forced to agree with it. Our goal is not persuasion. And just so you know, after our class last week, I published a separate talk, which is on the website, titled, "What is the Goal of Rhetoric?" Because I wanted to make this clear, and I actually talked about it in a separate video. And I recommend you watch that if you get a chance, because when you get into any kind of public speaking or writing, if you get into business one day and have to do advertising type work, you've really got to understand what the goal is, because if you get the goal wrong, you're going to make all kinds of bad decisions and mistakes that are going to hurt you and frustrate you. You need to understand clearly what the goal of rhetoric is, what the goal of writing and speaking is. What is the goal? Make sure you understand that. So we're going to try to learn how to do this now. We're going to get started in chapter 2. He says, "Again, therefore, as if defining from the beginning, let's discuss what remains." And here he's going to establish what rhetoric actually is. So this sentence right here in italics is going to be the most important sentence in this study. He says, "Let rhetoric be the power of perceiving in everything that which is capable of producing persuasion." Rhetoric is the power of perceiving in everything that which is capable of producing persuasion. That's what rhetoric is about. Like I said, it's not about persuading people. It's about perceiving or recognizing in everything, in any subject or any issue, any topic, the power to recognize what is capable of producing persuasion? What can be persuasive? That's the goal of rhetoric, to perceive in any subject or any issue what might be persuasive, what could be or what should be persuasive. Again, if the people are reasonable. That's the goal of rhetoric. And it's really important to understand that, even if it seems like I'm splitting hairs here and saying it's not the art of persuasion, because that's not in our power. And it's stupid to try to persuade people when really that you don't have the ability to do that. It's more complicated than that. Your job when you're communicating, or when you're even preparing to communicate, is to perceive in that subject or on that topic what could be persuasive. That's the goal of rhetoric, to develop that ability to recognize or identify what might be persuasive. And it's not just one thing or two things. It could be 100 different things. It could be all different kinds of persuasive arguments and evidences and so on. So it's a creative art where you've really got to be shrewd and creative to think about what relates to a certain question or issue that might have a persuasive effect on reasonable people. Or if people are, they're sort of in between and undecided, what might pull them over to the truth side, because the truth is the only side we should ever argue. So that's what rhetoric really is, the power of perceiving in everything that which is capable of producing persuasion. And you should write that down and just recite that sentence again and again and again until you've got it memorized, because that's the goal. Anytime you write or speak, anytime you're sitting down to prepare an essay, to prepare a paper, to prepare an advertisement for a business, to prepare a speech that you're giving, to prepare a discussion that you want to have with someone. You're having a problem in a relationship and you want to talk about it. And so you're taking some time to think about what you want to say or how you should say it. That's the art of rhetoric. And you've got to be careful to learn how to perceive in every different subject that which is capable of persuasion, because you could also say things that accomplish the opposite. You could say things that make people angry. You can say things that offend people or that insult people, or that you can accidentally say things that are wrong, and it reveals to people that they shouldn't trust you because some of the things you say are obviously false. So you can see you've got to be very careful when you speak, not to misspeak, not to talk about something accidentally or talk about something imprudently. You've got to think about what is capable of persuasion and make sure that that's what's presented when you communicate. So that's our definition. That's our working definition of rhetoric in our study of the art of rhetoric. Okay. And he says, this is the employment of no other art. There's no other art that does this, since each of the other arts is doctrinal or scientific, instructional, and persuasive about that which is the subject of its consideration. And some of you were with me yesterday when we studied the Summa Theologica. Remember, St. Thomas was talking about this in the second article of the Summa when he talks about whether sacred doctrine is a science. He said there are two different kinds of sciences. There's one kind of science that reasons from absolute truths, or from self-evident truths, I should say, not absolute, self-evident truths. And then there's another kind of science that takes those sciences for granted and builds on them, right? So all arts and sciences are persuasive about that which is the subject of its consideration. Geometry deals with magnitudes, and he's going to talk about this later. I probably shouldn't give too many examples because he'll do it. But different sciences focus on just their subject, and they argue with people who accept their principles. Rhetoric is different because it argues on all subjects. It's general. It applies to all subjects. So rhetoric is different. It's a classical liberal art. It's not one of these practical or professional arts. Thus, for instance, he says, medicine is doctrinal and persuasive about that which is salubrious and morbid. Salubrious means healthful, morbid means relating to sickness. Medicine is doctrinal and persuasive about sickness and health. Geometry is doctrinal and persuasive about the properties accidental to magnitudes. And just by the way here, this is an interesting little description of geometry from Aristotle that helps us understand exactly what geometry is. Geometry is doctrinal and persuasive about the properties accidental to magnitudes. And if we don't understand that, we don't really understand what geometry is. So it's good to find passages like this as we're reading Aristotle in other subjects, because they challenge how we're doing in a subject like geometry. Are we really understanding what geometry is about? If so, we'll understand what this means. If we have no idea what this means, we're probably not doing too well in geometry. And then in arithmetic, he says, arithmetic is doctrinal and persuasive about the properties accidental to number. Okay, so we've got a geometry and arithmetic and medicine used as examples of other arts that are specific. They're not general like rhetoric, right? The like also takes place in the other arts and sciences. They're all specialized. But rhetoric appears to be able to survey about any given thing what is adapted to produce persuasion. And this is another reason why this skill is so important. A person who develops the skill and art of rhetoric can be useful in any different subject or area of professional life. That's why when we think about people like advertising or marketing experts, they're experts at selling things or promoting things. They can be hired by people from all different businesses. A medical office could hire an advertiser, an auto mechanic could hire an advertiser, a construction company could hire an advertiser, a computer programming company could hire an advertiser, and that advertiser can serve all of those different businesses because the skill of advertising, which relates to rhetoric, is a general skill that applies to all different subjects. So you can see the value of a skill like rhetoric. It allows you to do many different things. And in our society, sometimes your specialized skill doesn't work out so well for you, and you may need to do more than one thing. So having these general skills, gaining these general skills in your education becomes very important later in life. I'm an example of this. You know, I studied to be a classicist, and my interest in classical studies was simply to study and teach classics. That's what I wanted to do. But as my career developed and I had more and more opportunities, technology changed, and all of a sudden, teaching from books and teaching in classrooms, in schools, no longer became necessary. So the teaching profession changed, the work of classicists changed, and because I had these general skills, I was able to do other things and still continue to focus on my work as a classicist. The general education that I had helped me to continue to adapt and adjust to the changes that were taking place. Whereas if I was just a classicist who knew nothing but his classical studies, I don't even know what I would be doing now. And many people get into professions like that, where they've just got this one-track mind, they have no general skills, and when their field changes in some way, they're lost. There's nothing that they can do. I can give you another example quickly while I'm on the topic. When I was in high school, I wanted to be an architect. That's what I wanted to do. And so all through high school, all 4 years of high school, I was given the opportunity to take electives, to choose some kind of class that I wanted to take. And I chose to take our classes that were called mechanical drawing in high school. So I went, and it was a room that looked like an architect's office, and we learned how to do all kinds of architectural and mechanical drawing. It was in the early 1990s, and everything was done on paper with pencils and erasers and rulers and compasses. It was all manual drawing, learning all of the skills that were needed for mechanical drawing or architectural drawing. And I loved it. I knew that's what I wanted to do with my life. I wanted to go to school and be an architect. And I devoted 4 years of high school to learning mechanical drafting. Well, my senior year of high school, all of a sudden, the architectural industry changed, and it moved from handwritten drawing to computer drawing. And the computers came out, and all of a sudden in our mechanical drawing classes, there was a row of computers in the room, and we had to start doing all of the drawings on computers. Well, I had no interest in using computers. I had no interest in architecture if it meant that I had to draw on a computer. I really just liked drawing by hand on paper. That's what I actually liked about it. So when the industry changed the way it worked, all of my interest and I think skill in it was lost. And so I lost all interest. That's what often happens to people when they get into careers. The career will change, the industry will change, and all of a sudden it becomes something that they're really not good at or that they're really not interested in. So it's important for us, before we just jump into career choices and professional specialties, it's important for us to ask, what general skills am I developing that will allow me to enter into adult life and be able to handle all of these changes that take place? They require general skills that allow us to do lots of different things well. Rhetoric is one of those skills, okay? Rhetoric appears to be able to survey about any given thing what is adapted to produce persuasion. Hence also we say that it does not possess an artificial power about any certain, peculiar, definite genus. So rhetoric is not about some specific subject, but it's a general art that applies to all different topics, and you shouldn't need to be persuaded that rhetoric is important. But at the same time, this is a good example where we see students presented with something that's obviously true who will choose not to study it. You know, we've got 4 students in here for a course on classical rhetoric, because I guess Christians think that they're not going to need to know the art of rhetoric to do well in life. And you can just see, it doesn't matter how reasonable this is, doesn't matter how often I explain it to parents and students, they still won't study something like rhetoric, and they'll all be crammed into an algebra class, which almost none of them are ever going to use. That's the problem with modern education. Let's go on with Aristotle here. With respect to things which procure credibility, some of them are without art and others are artificial. So our concern is to figure out, how can we discover proofs for things? Where can we look for proofs? Where can we come up with good arguments, persuasive arguments? Some of the arguments that need to be made, some of the proofs, I should say, are not a matter of art. They exist outside of us. They already exist, as he's going to explain. Some of them are artificial. Some of them we have to actually use our knowledge of rhetoric and dialectic to discover. Some of them are our job to discover. Others of them already exist. So when we seek to find credible arguments or persuasive messages, some of them are going to be outside of us that we just have to go and use. Others are inside of us that need to be discovered and brought out as our arguments. And he goes on to explain this here. I call those without art, which are not devised by us, but which exist prior, that means outside of us, which exist prior to all artificial invention. And he gives some examples. So there are some proofs that we don't come up with. They already exist. For example, witnesses. If there's a crime, for example, and we have a person who was there, we have a group of people who were there and saw it, I don't have to come up with some, complex argument to try to, prove that a person is guilty like Sherlock Holmes when we've got 5 people that saw it happen and were there. So witnesses are a source of proof, and they're not artificial. We don't have to make up those arguments. They're ready to go. We just have to bring them into the courtroom. All right. So one example is witnesses. Another is questioning, right? Asking, letting the witnesses or people involved in the case just tell us the details of the story, questioning. Another translation translates that word as tortures. So I don't know if it just means questions in general, or if it's talking about like forcing confessions out of people. That'd be a different issue. Writings, by writings, it means just evidence of things, like we've got emails that show that they were talking about this, and we have evidence. And then today in our generation, I mean, obviously Aristotle's generation was limited in what they had in terms of evidence, but today we've got pictures, videos, sound recordings, phone messages, DNA samples, all of this stuff. Forensic investigations can find all kinds of evidence like fingerprints or, blood that's spilled, all kinds of different stuff, right? But it's basically explaining different forms of evidence, right? That are not rhetorical, that are not invented by us, but just exist in different cases, in different arguments, and so on. And let's just not talk about like legal cases. Let's also talk about something like advertising, right? Witnesses, if we're talking about advertising, would be, like people, customers who have used the product, used the service, they give their testimony. We don't need to invent a persuasive argument if there's 10,000 people who have used this product and they all love it. They are a source of proof that exist outside of us. So there's lots of different sources of proof. Some of them are outside of us, but others we have to discover. And again, a good example of this, and I recommend this again, is Sherlock Holmes and all the Sherlock Holmes stories, to see how he enters into a situation where there appears to be no evidence, there appears to be a problem that there's no solution to. And he goes through collecting all of these different bits and pieces of things, asking questions and so on. And then he formulates this argument that sort of becomes clear at the end of the story. And everybody's amazed that he could put all these different things together and invent this argument, discover this argument. And then he explains, it's all by deductive reasoning. That's the idea that Aristotle's getting at here with this idea of artificial proof, the ability to actually creatively discover proofs for different things that we can present and show different things we're arguing to be reasonable and credible. Okay, so there's sources of proof outside of us which we can make use of. And then there are artificial proofs, which we actually have to come up with, which are capable, he says, of being procured methodically. That means by the use of this art. We have to learn this art and then employ this art because it will help us to discover these proofs, because we're going to learn that these proofs can be drawn from certain common places that can be used in all different subjects, in all different situations. So some exist outside of us, some have to be developed by us, and therefore it is requisite, he says, to use the former, use those sources of proof that exist outside of us already, and discover the artificial forms of proof. Sometimes there's sufficient evidence in external sources where we don't even need to come up with an argument. It's just obvious, like something's caught on camera or something like that. We don't need to come up with some creative argument when we've got video of the person committing the crime, or we've got, evidence of satisfied customers. We really don't have to come up with some complicated argument. But there are other times where these easy external sources of proof don't exist, and we've got to come up with creative proofs in order to be persuasive about what's true. Okay? Next paragraph, we get into this subject of credibility, and this is a really important paragraph here, which I encourage you study carefully and really master. It's very, very helpful. And I'll go through it quickly. Of credibility, he says, credibility is persuasiveness, right? Of being able to come up with things that other people find to be persuasive, credibility. Of credibility, which is procured by argument, that is artificial credibility, the kind we're concerned with in rhetoric, he says there are three species, and this is really important because we've got to understand there are three kinds of argument, three species of credibility. You can imagine how important that is, right? You can realize how important it is to understand this. Three different ways we can be persuasive. These are called the rhetorical appeals. And I'm going to write that in the chat real quick just so you see the phrase. These are called the three rhetorical appeals. And I'm going to list them in the chat here, if you give me just 1 second. Just a second, I'm typing them here for you. One second. Three rhetorical appeals or three persuasive appeals. And we're going to go into those in this next paragraph here. So these are very important. All right. Actually, the first one I typed wrong. It should be ethos, not ethics. Sorry. Ethos, pathos, and logos. These are the three species of credibility. All right. Three species of credibility. Give me a quick yes, just to let me know that you see that. The three rhetorical appeals. Everybody see that? Good. Okay. So he's going to explain that in this paragraph here, and it's very important. And you'll see how helpful it becomes in all of your communication. And it also is challenging because we have to realize that these things are true, and we have to subject ourselves to them. I'll talk about that in a minute, but it's very important. All right, so three species of credibility. And I listed them there: ethos, pathos, and logos. And we're going to see him talk about each of these, though he doesn't mention those Greek words. He talks about each of those three things here in this paragraph. He says the first kind of credibility, the first kind consists in the manners of the speaker. That's ethos. The first kind of credibility consists in the manners of the speaker. That is, the speaker himself is persuasive. The speaker himself has a persuasive effect on the audience. The manners of the speaker. And you all know what this means because you experience it, right? This is where your personal character, your appearance, your behavior, your education, your manners, and so on are influential on people who listen to you. If you're obnoxious, people are going to want to ignore you and reject what you say just because you're obnoxious. If you're hypocritical, you're yelling at people about self-control while you yourself don't practice self-control, no one's going to listen to that, nonsense argument because your manners turn them off and make your message impossible to listen to. So the manner of the speaker has a persuasive effect. If it's right, if it's good, it has a persuasive effect on the audience. Your manners as a speaker. Secondly, the disposition of the hearer. The disposition of the hearer. In other words, the emotional state, the passions, the circumstances that the hearer is in. So, for example, if you want to tell a joke to someone, you shouldn't try it at a funeral service because the people at the funeral are in a certain disposition and they're not interested in a joke. If you want to try to gain a new client for your business and you're at a funeral service, it's not the right time to try and pitch your product to someone who's grieving the death of their husband, right? So you can see that the disposition or the emotional state of the audience also has to be considered as we think about how to seek to be persuasive, right? The disposition of the hearer. You may know that a certain group is prejudiced against a certain idea. That's their disposition. You've got to consider that when you think of what might be persuasive in speaking to them. So we've got to think about the disposition of the hearer. And then third, the argument itself. The argument itself, the quality of your argument itself. So three things affect persuasion: the manners of the speaker and his personal credibility, the disposition of the hearers, and third, the quality of the argument. Now, this is why in modern society, we'll often hear Christian people say things like, we don't have to worry about nothing. We just have to say the truth. That's false in rhetorical art. That's false. There's a right person to say things. There's a right way to say things. There's a right time to say things. And remember, the goal of rhetoric is to try to act as persuasively as possible, not to persuade people because that's not in our control, but to consider what might be persuasive. So being obnoxious, even if your argument is true, is not rhetorical because that's not going to procure credibility. It's got to be said in the right way by the right person at the right time to people in the right disposition, and the arguments also have to be sound arguments. So all three of those things have to be taken into consideration for any message, whether it's spoken, written, recorded, whatever, to be credible, to be persuasive. All three of those things are influential and have to be considered. So you might have the best argument, you might have the best answer, the best idea, but you're just not the person to present it. And I'll give you a good example of this on television. Many comedy shows, they have comedians on the shows, but the comedians don't write their jokes. The comedians deliver the jokes. The comedians present the jokes, but behind the scenes, there are comedy writers who write the jokes. Now, the writers, they may be extraordinarily funny people, and they may be great at writing jokes, but they would not be good at delivering those jokes. And so they find a person who, for some reason, maybe he's like a handsome, popular actor, or he's just got a real funny personality. They write the jokes and give them to that person to deliver. So you can see how when they do that, they're taking ethos into consideration. They're taking the right message, but they're saying, I'm not the right person to deliver this. We're going to give this joke to this person and let him deliver it. They do the same thing in music. You'll often find that many of the popular musicians, they don't write their own music. There are people behind the scenes writing the music, but that real musician says, I'm not going, if I presented this song, it wouldn't be popular because I'm old, or I'm not really handsome, or I'm not I'm not beautiful. But if we had this person sing this song, or this person play this song, it's going to be a huge hit because we're taking a good song and we're allowing the right person to present that song. And that's how the music business works. So you can see rhetoric at work in those different arts, whether it's comedy or, music or any kind of acting and drama. The people writing the plays are not the ones actually performing the plays. They get people to perform the play who are actually better for the sake of the desired influence of the story than the writers would be. So we can see this in practice in a number of different fields. Advertising agencies will come up with a great argument for the advertising campaign, but they'll have a celebrity go on television and present the message. That's ethos, okay? So you can see, we see that around us all over the place. We've got to think about how it affects us personally when we do things. So you might have the right answer, but you're just not the person to make that argument. I deal with this all the time because with, let's say, education and homeschooling, I may be the one who has the answers on certain questions, but if we get contacted by a homeschool mother, I just know that my way of communicating, homeschool mothers are not going to like it. I'm too rough. I'm too, like to the point and factual. I'm not very compassionate with this kind of stuff. It's better to have my wife answer the question, even though she's going to say the same thing I'll say. She's going to say it in a different way. They're going to hear it from a woman, and it has a different rhetorical effect. That's just how ethos works. Okay. So ethos, then the disposition of the hearer, the circumstances they're in, and you all understand how this works. If there's something that you want, let's say, you get your driver's license and you want to borrow your parents' car, and you walk into the room and you can just see that dad is not in a good mood, that that's not the time to ask to borrow the car. And so you'll try to do something else first, like say, hey, dad, can I make you a cup of coffee? And you'll try to change dad's mood and make him, put him in good spirits so that then you can ask the question you'd like to ask. You're using rhetoric. You're using that second persuasive appeal there. Or what my kids do is they know that I have a favorite kid, or they think I have a favorite kid. And so when they want to ask something, they'll say, hey, go ask dad if we can, do this or that. And they'll send that kid in to ask the question. That's good rhetoric. So you see, we do this natural. We understand this because we're rational creatures. We already do this in some things, but then what doesn't make much sense is we get into other situations and we act like we don't need to do the same thing. And we do need to do the same thing. And that's the purpose of the study of the art of rhetoric. So having the right manners in the speaker, whether we can be that speaker or whether we need to find somebody else to deliver a message for us, that has to do with ethos, the appeal of the speaker, whether the people are in the right disposition and it's proper for us to talk about an issue at a certain time or try to lead them to a decision at a certain time, or whether we need to first change their disposition or wait for another time when they're in a better disposition. That's pathos. That's the second rhetorical appeal. And then lastly, the quality of our argument, which is the third thing. Not the only thing, it's the most important thing, because ultimately, when there's really serious decisions to make, ultimately people demand clear reasoning and proof. But in most situations, these other issues, ethos and pathos, are very influential. So rhetoric is the pursuit of an understanding of what's credible with respect to all three of these things, these three different species of credibility. We can't ignore them. We can't pretend that one of them is not important. They're all important, and we always have to take all of them into consideration. If I came on the camera here to teach classical studies, and in my background I had a poster of some rock star, and I had a pink mohawk with my hair spiked up, and I was wearing a tank top, not many people would take those classes seriously. They would say, look at this wacko. There's no way we're going to let this guy talk to us about reasoning and rhetoric. He looks like he just got out of prison. So even if I said the same exact thing and taught the same exact lessons in same exact classes, no one would subscribe to have a teacher who doesn't look like a classical school teacher. That's just the reality. If I did it in the wrong way, if I did it at the wrong time, people wouldn't support it. And we all know that. And that's why, when teenagers go through their moody phase of life and they think that they shouldn't have to listen to adults and they could do whatever they want, you see what they're doing is they're not taking into consideration these realities of the manners of the speaker, the disposition of the hearer, the soundness of the message. They're not taking into consideration they're not taking consideration of those things, and they can make decisions that are life-destroying decisions that they might never recover from, especially if you get a bad reputation, or you end up getting into legal trouble, or you put a tattoo across your face. You may make a decision and say, I don't care what anybody. It absolutely does matter what other people think. Absolutely does matter, because you're going to need to do things and argue things and try to accomplish things in the future. And you can make one-time decisions in your life that make you untrustworthy for the rest of your life. And people do that all the time. So learning the art of rhetoric, understanding these three appeals, and then asking yourself, how ought I to live in light of the reality of these three appeals? Because my ultimate success and happiness are going to be dependent on my ability to appeal to people through my own character, through their own disposition, through the quality of my arguments. So we've got to consider all three of those things. And if we're going to be wise and if we want to be happy, we've got to make decisions with an understanding of how human persuasion actually works. All right. So we're going to stop there. Like I said, we're getting into a paragraph here that's really important. So we'll devote a whole class to that, even though we've gotten through it quite a bit already. But we'll start there in our next class. We'll go through these three species of credibility again, and then realize that the study of rhetoric is just an investigation of these three things. So we're going to dive into these things in great detail and really learn how to understand and act in light of these things, which is going to help you in every area of your life, from personal relationships to telephone calls, to essay writing, public speaking, everything. It affects every area of your life because everything comes down to human persuasion. All right. So that's all for today. It's 12 o'clock. I hope that's helpful. I'm pretty sure that that's a helpful walk through the beginning of chapter 2, but we're just going to take our time, go through all this content, make sure it's clear. I want you to study these lessons on your own and start answering the assignment questions and preparing your assignments. And then as we go through them, you can get them all done. Your answers will be perfect and you can move easily through these courses, okay? So I hope that's helpful. If anything's not clear or if there's anything you'd like to talk to that's related to these topics, we can do that. But that's all for today. So I'm going to turn off our recording. And then if there's anything you'd like to chat about, we can do that privately. All right. Thank you, guys.